Hi, so this is now my first attempt at a video lecture, and so this is my first lecture for the A&P series, and what I just noticed while I was now in my third iteration of trying to do this, that one of the things I decided not to cover in this version is scientific method, so you do not need to worry about that. But today's lecture will talk about what is A&P, so define the terms anatomy and physiology, followed by talking about the concept of homeostasis and why that's so important to physiological processes, and then go into some of the basic concepts or processes that are needed for life. So what are the characteristics that make up all life? What are the levels of biological organization in which we use to understand life? And finally, an introduction to some of the basic chemistry surrounding understanding life. So starting out, I would like to define anatomy. So anatomy is broken into two parts. You've got ana and tomi. Ana means a part, and tomi is to cut. So basically, anatomy is the study of the structures of the body and their relationship to each other. So study of body and their So first term I'd like to define is anatomy. And anatomy is broken up from two words. So ana means apart, tome is cut. So it's basically you're cutting apart the body. And so anatomy is the study of the structures of the body and their relationship to each other. And the second part of the course is going to be physiology. Physiology, physio for nature, ology, study, is the study of the function of the body parts. And combined, this gives us anatomy, which is a study of form, physiology, which is a study of function, and they are really a complementary set of fields. And what we mean by complementary is that you really can't have anatomy without physiology, so you really can't understand form without understanding what it does, and you can't understand physiology without knowing what the parts are that are involved. So you can't understand one without the other. So next part of today's lecture is going to be talking about the levels of structural organization. So we start out with the simplest level, which is chemical. And so this includes atoms, which you can see here, and molecules, so atoms and molecules. Second level is cellular level, so we take these atoms and molecules together, make them into the simplest unit of life. So in this example, this is a smooth muscle cell. So cellular. The third level is you take a series of cells and cluster them together to form a tissue. So in 3 here, this is smooth muscle tissue. And what defines a tissue is that it's usually made of 2 or more types of cells that are functioning together to have a common function. If you take these multiple tissues and combine them together, you then get to the organ level. So in this case, this is the stomach. The stomach is made up of both. So here you can see the smooth muscle that we've just been talking about, but it's also layered of some mucosa or epithelial tissue. You also have some connective tissue anchoring it. So it's made up of multiple tissue types, but again, functioning together to allow a common function. You can then group organs together into an organ system. And so in this example, we've been talking about the digestive system. And the digestive system, again, is involved in processing food, so basically breaking food apart, extracting the nutrients from it. We then put all of those things together, and we get put all of those organ systems together, and you have an entire organism, which in this example is the little girl. So the digestive system being one of multiple parts, multiple organ systems. So we also have the cardiovascular system, nervous system, basically all the systems that we'll be studying this year. So next thing we're going to talk about now is the requirements for life. And so this example here, we're looking at a living fly, and then on the left side, and then on the right side is a squash fly. And really the question is, well, what's the difference? There's the same molecules. This was actually shown to me when I was taking my one of the first days of biology class when I was an undergraduate, and the professor brought in a cockroach and held it up in his hands and asked everybody if the cockroach was alive, asked if the cockroach was alive, which it was, and then he smashed it and asked, is it still alive and why not? And so then had us sort of think through the process of what are the things that define something as being living versus not living. And so some of the necessary functions that really define life is that as a living organism, to be able to keep ourselves alive, we need to maintain barriers or boundaries between the inside world, so within us, and the outside. Because as soon as those boundaries are gone, basically our body reaches an equilibrium, you're unable to make any sort of energy gradient, and you can no longer live. All living organisms need to be able to move. So this includes both external movements, such as moving from a food source or a source of water from one location to another, or also internal movements, such as moving blood from one part of the body to another, or nervous signals from one part of the body to another. Living organisms need to be able to respond to the environment, so they need to have some way of detecting and altering their condition as the external environment changes. They need to be able to digestion, so they need to be able to break down molecules and extract energy to be able to provide nutrients so they can actually carry out their own chemical processes, which is really metabolism. So metabolism is basically the sum of all of the chemical processes that keep us alive. We then generate a fair amount of waste, and so you need to be able to excrete that waste, get the waste out of your body so it doesn't build up and become toxic. A living organism is defined as needing to reproduce. And so again, this can also be at the whole organism level. So as a human, we have babies, but this is also at the cellular level. One cell will divide and make 2 baby cells. And then the last is all organisms grow as part of living. And so this is part of a function of being small. Basically, as part of reproduction, you reproduce, make small organisms, and then they have to grow to become larger organisms so that they can reproduce. This is both at the cellular level and also at the whole organismal level. So what are the things that we really need to survive? And so this picture here showing a spaceman or space person is a good illustration of what are the things that they need to be carrying with them. So probably first on that list, thing that would probably kill them fastest if they don't have is oxygen. And the reason that they have oxygen is that they need oxygen to break down nutrients, most of which this astronaut is carrying with them inside their body. But if it's a longer excursion, you can bring nutrients with you to digest them. You also need a source of water to keep hydrated. Water is basically 80% of our body, and without it, we won't be able to thrive. All of the metabolic processes in our body require a very narrow temperature range. So we are endothermic, meaning we make our own heat, but our body temperature basically goes within a range of plus or minus 3 or 4 degrees at most, and we're most happy really within that sort of 98 to 101 degree range. So stable, normal body temperature. And I know there's plenty of animals out there that can have a whole range of temperatures, but to really thrive, there's sort of one ideal temperature for even something like a snake or a lizard that is exothermic and has to go in and out of the sun or cool, basically use the environment to heat and cool themselves off. And then the final one of these, this is one that also space is a good illustration for, is that we need to have appropriate atmospheric pressure. Atmospheric pressure. So basically we have to keep our body at the right temperature to allow us to absorb enough oxygen, which we will talk about when we get to the respiratory system. So we're now to the fourth part of the lecture, which is talking about homeostasis. And homeostasis to me is one of the central themes of all of physiology, and it really defines it's the process of the body maintaining a stable internal environment. So process through which the body maintains a stable internal environment. And this is despite external changes. Despite external changes. So this is what allows us to live both in Phoenix, Arizona, where it can be 125 degrees Fahrenheit, and also survive in the Arctic, where it can be minus 60. And our bodies can adapt potentially with the aid of some clothes. The process through which homeostasis is maintained is through what's known as dynamic equilibrium. And what's meant by that is basically the body will have a set range rather than a single set point. So maintains basically going, if this is homeostasis, you'll have the conditions going up and down around a single set point. And a good example of this is when you look at a thermostat in your house. If you set the temperature to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, the heater, and we'll talk about wintertime as a condition where the heater's turning on and off. The heater will heat up your house to roughly 70 degrees. It will turn off. It will then have 45 minutes or an hour to cool off back to 68 degrees. And then heater turns on again, warms it back up to 72 degrees. The house cools off. Then the heater's off, and then the heater turns on again. And what this allows is a more efficient way of maintaining equilibrium or homeostasis rather than trying to have, okay, this is the exact set point in which the heater would just be turning on and off, on and off, on and off constantly. So how does homeostasis work? So if we start out with this, I guess kind of a seesaw or balance, and in this condition, body's in balance. First thing that happens is you get a stimulus. The stimulus changes the conditions, so now the body's no longer in balance. So what happens next is then a receptor needs to detect that change. The receptor detects that the body's condition's no longer in balance and sends that information to a control center, which most of the time is going to be the central nervous system, but we also have control centers at other regions of our body. It does this through what's known as an afferent pathway. So afferent, I would focus on the A because it's approaching the control center. This will be true when we talk about nerve fibers. So an afferent neuron is one that approaches the brain, and we'll talk about the other one in a second. So the control center detects that there's an imbalance and to rectify that, sends a signal out through the efferent fiber or efferent pathway, which you would remember by exit, and that leaves the control center of brain going to an effector where some tissue responds. And ultimately that effector then is what initiates the response and basically brings the body back into balance. And so we have this basic pathway where you have a stimulus that's perceived by the receptor, control center detects that thing, control center detects the change, it then sends a command to the effector, which then initiates a response and brings everything back into balance. The mechanism that we just talked about is known as a negative feedback loop. This is because this is an endocrine example where you have the hypothalamus is basically the body's being exposed to cold up here. I could change colors. So let's see. So we're getting cold up here. The hypothalamus responds to that by releasing thyrotropin releasing hormone, which is one hormone that then stimulates the anterior pituitary to release thyrotropin. Thyrotropin goes to the thyroid gland, releasing thyroxin. Thyroxin then feeds back to the anterior pituitary and also the hypothalamus and inhibits the release, basically maintaining homeostasis where the response shuts down. The response to the stimulus shuts down eliminates the stimulus but shuts down the response at the same time, so it shuts itself down. I'm not sure that was very clear. The other mechanism of maintaining homeostasis is through a positive feedback loop, and this is one we'll talk about more later in the semester, where instead of the response shutting down the stimulus, the response to the stimulus basically increases the stimulus. And so this is one of the examples is labor, where here the baby's head right here is pushing up against the mom's cervix, and that stimulus causes a nerve impulse that is basically sends a signal to the brain where it releases oxytocin. Oxytocin comes back down and causes the uterus to contract, which then pushes the baby's body even harder up against the cervix, which then increases the signal. And this is known as a positive feedback loop. Still a mechanism of homeostasis because the mom, once the baby is born, will be back at homeostasis, back to baseline conditions. So there's only a few examples of this. Probably the best one we just talked about is labor, but one that we'll talk about early in the second section of the course is blood clotting as well. Okay, last part of today's lecture is going to be talking about the chemistry of life. And so first thing I want to talk about is define a few terms. So in terms of chemistry, an element is the simplest form of a class of matter to still have unique chemical properties. Basically, another thing, this is basically you can't break anything down smaller than an element and still have the properties of whatever that element is. So if you're looking at gold, which is very unreactive metal, you can't separate gold into anything smaller and still have those properties. A single unit of an element is called an atom. So I know for those of you that have taken chemistry, this is the planetary model, which is not terribly accurate in terms of representing how electrons orbit around the nucleus, but it is a good way of conceiving basic atomic structure. And so there's three types of subatomic particles that I want you to know about. So electrons, protons, and neutrons. So first one here is the proton, and this is the subatomic particle who the number of protons is what defines the element. And so since we're talking about biology, one of the most common elements in our body is carbon. A 6-proton atom is carbon. So if you go to 1 proton, then that's hydrogen. 2, I believe, is helium. But basically, number of protons tells you what element you're looking at. When you combine a proton with a neutron, which is another subatomic particle, that gives you the atomic mass. Because this third component, the electron, really has no mass. So to get the atomic mass of an atom, you add the number of protons and the number of neutrons. If you look at the periodic table, there's usually a variation. So it'll be like, for carbon, it would be like 12.005 or something. I'm just guessing on that. But the extra number is because of the atomic mass that's reported on the periodic table is giving you an average across all atomic species of that element. And there's something called, what are they called? They're not isomers. They are, this is interesting. Let me pause this for a second. Okay, isotope. That was the term I was looking for. I'm not sure why I couldn't think of that. But basically, you can have carbon with 6 protons and 6 neutrons, which would give you an atomic mass of 12, or 6 protons and 8 neutrons, which give you atomic mass of 14, or carbon 14. We're not going to talk about that much because isotopes are less relevant for human biology. So the last thing we'll talk about are electrons and protons, which are responsible for the electrical charge of a molecule or atom. Responsible for electrical charge. And this is going to be significant for what we're doing. So again, just to reiterate, atomic number is the number of protons. Atomic mass is number of protons plus number of neutrons. And so 1 mass unit equals 1 proton or 1 neutron, and we just assume that electrons have a mass of about 0. And so this is typically reported as the mass of the atom in atomic mass units. Which is 1 proton per unit. Okay, so because we're going to be talking a lot about electrical charge when we talk about action potentials, I do want you to understand something about ions. So an ion is where the number of protons and number of electrons is not equal. There's supposed to be a not equal there. It does not equal the number of electrons. And so a cation is an ion that is positively charged. And so that means that there's more protons than electrons. And if it's an anion, it is negatively charged. And in that case, there's more electrons than protons. So in this example down here, you start out with a sodium atom, and if it loses its outer electron, which it likes to do because it's 1 electron sitting all by itself and it's less stable, so it ionizes and becomes a positively charged cation. So in terms of exercise physiology and nutrition, a lot of times people talk about electrolytes. So an electrolyte is simply any substance that becomes an ion in water. And free radicals are those elements that contain odd numbers of electrons, which then causes them to ionize other molecules, destroying them. Atoms or molecules with an odd number of electrons. And so they ionize other atoms or molecules. And when that happens, the molecule is destroyed. So next time, or next lecture, we'll be talking about chemical bonds, talk about pH, and then we will start talking through some of the larger biological macromolecules. And at the end of each lecture, I will give you this list, basically of the terms that I'd like you to know that are introduced in this lecture, and then some of the concepts I'd like you to be able to apply. Hopefully these will get smoother as I get more practice with this. Thanks.